Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring something pretty complex and fascinating, and that's the concept of gender in society.
It's definitely a topic that's been generating a lot of discussion and debate.
For sure. And, in preparing for this deep dive, I kept coming back to this one question that was posed in our source material. It's like this, almost like a riddle. Can we really have genuine individual expression while still acknowledging, these really deeply ingrained social structures around gender? It's something that's been on my mind quite a bit.
It's a real paradox, isn't it? The gender paradox, in fact.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting when we start looking at, examples in literature, in media, even in our own lives of how this paradox kind of plays out. Our source also brings up this really unique way of looking at identity through what they call subpersonalities, which we'll definitely want to get into a bit later.
Yeah, that's a really intriguing concept.
Okay, so before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's just make sure we're all on the same page here. What exactly are we talking about when we say the gender paradox?
Well, think about it this way.
Yeah.
You know, each of us is unique, right? We have our own personalities, interests, aspirations. But from the moment we're born, society tends to kind of slot us into these categories, male or female, and it attaches a whole set of expectations to those labels.
It's almost like we're handed a script and we're expected to just perform it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The gender paradox arises from that tension. The tension between our desire to express our authentic selves and the pressure to conform to these predefined roles.
It seems so deeply ingrained in everything. I mean, where does this whole gender categorization system even come from? Have you ever thought about that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating, right? Think back to early human societies. Divisions of labor likely emerged, and you can see how those divisions might have solidified into expectations based on, physical differences between men and women.
Yeah.
Over time, those expectations became woven into cultural narratives, religious beliefs, even legal systems.
So gender became like a shorthand for predicting behavior and organizing society?
Precisely. And to a certain extent, that can be helpful. But the problem is when it becomes overly rigid, when those categories start to limit individual potential and expression. And our source that highlight this by talking about this double bind that arises from this gender paradox.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What do they mean by this double bind?
Well, imagine this. If you conform too rigidly to gender expectations, you risk being seen as a stereotype lacking individuality. But if you dare to break the mold, you face potential judgment or criticism or even ostracism for not adhering to those norms.
That really resonates with me. It's like there's this narrow path you're supposed to walk, and if you step outside of it, there can be consequences.
Exactly. And that path, as our source points out, is often quite different depending on whether you're perceived as male or female.
Oh, for sure. It's like two totally different sets of rules.
Right. So where do we see this double bind playing out in the real world? Well, think about literature and media, for example.
Okay, yeah.
Male authors writing female characters. They're often criticized for either getting it wrong or falling into cliches. And female protagonists, they face constant scrutiny.
Oh, totally.
Too traditional, they're boring, too independent, they're unrealistic or unlikable.
It's so frustrating. And don't even get me started on that whole gendered genre thing. It's like romance is for women, action is for men. Where's the room for everyone to just enjoy what they enjoy?
It's limiting, for sure. And it's not just in the fictional world. This double bind also plays out in everyday social interactions.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen this firsthand. Women can be labeled as like pick-me girls for trying to fit in to what they think men want. Or they might be seen as trying too hard or attention-seeking if they challenge expectations.
Right. And for men, expressing emotions outside of anger or stoicism can be seen as weak or less competent.
It's like we're trapped in these roles, even when we don't want to be. And what about, people who don't identify neatly within the male or female binary? Where do they fit into all of this?
That's where the paradox becomes even more challenging, as they're constantly navigating a world that doesn't fully recognize their identity. Their struggle for authenticity is often, even more fraught.
So with all of this in mind, how do we break free from this paradox? Are there even any solutions? Our source actually offers some surprisingly nuanced answers to these questions.
They do. And interestingly enough, they begin by acknowledging the value of gender divisions.
Wait, really? That's not what I expected.
I know, right? It might seem counterintuitive, but they argue that gender categories can provide a sense of shared history and understanding, even a framework for social change.
So like historical examples of how women organizing together as women led to advancements in women's rights.
Exactly. And many cultural traditions are tied to gender identity, providing meaning and connection for those who embrace them. The key, they suggest, is finding a balance.
So it's not about erasing gender completely.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
It's more about recognizing the complexities and finding a way to honor those categories without letting them become rigid barriers to individual expression.
So flexibility is key. Finding a way to acknowledge those categories without getting boxed in by them.
Precisely. And that's where some of their other solutions come in.
So how do we actually start to break free from these boxes? Our source suggests we need to move beyond the binary.
Exactly. They argue that personality traits and skills and interests aren't inherently tied to biological sex.
You mean just because someone is born female, it doesn't automatically mean that they're going to, love wearing pink and playing with dolls?
Exactly.
And on the other hand, not every boy is going to be obsessed with sports or cars. We need more, flexible understandings of masculinity and femininity.
Right, to allow for that greater expression.
But what about biological differences? I mean, they do exist, right? So how does our source address that?
They acknowledge that biological differences, like hormonal variations, can influence behavior, on average, but they caution against using those differences to limit individual potential.
So it's not about setting rules, but about recognizing patterns.
Exactly. We can acknowledge that on average, men might be physically stronger.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that every man is going to be a bodybuilder or that women can't be strong.
Makes sense. So how do we actually start shifting these perceptions? What can we do?
Our source emphasizes the power of representation.
So seeing more diverse gender expressions in the media, in the stories we tell.
Exactly. When we see a wider range of gender identities and behaviors reflected in the stories that we consume, it normalizes those different ways of being.
So it challenges those stereotypes we were talking about earlier.
Right. If all you ever see are these, one-dimensional portrayals of women on TV, you might start to think that's the only way to be a woman.
Makes sense. Our source also brought up promoting discussions on gender fluidity. What do you think they mean by that?
This is where things get really interesting. It's about challenging the idea that these gender expectations are fixed, that they don't change.
So what's considered masculine in one culture might be different in another.
Exactly. Or that ideas about gender roles have evolved, even within our own lifetimes.
Right, for sure.
Having these open conversations about those variations, it helps to break down the idea that there's one right way to be a man or a woman.
We also have to remember that gender doesn't exist in a vacuum,
Mhm.
Race, class, culture, all of these things intersect with gender.
Absolutely. You're so right. That's the concept of intersectionality, and our source touches on it as well.
Yeah.
It's so important to consider how these different aspects of our identities influence, how we experience the world and how we navigate the world.
So it's complex. There's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to gender.
Right. And ultimately, our source argues that we need to kind of shift away from gender-based assumptions and start valuing people based on their individual traits and their characters.
So their skills, their character, their values, who they are as a person rather than what we assume about them based on their gender.
Exactly. Imagine a world where we prioritize, merit and inclusivity over these, outdated gendered expectations.
That sounds pretty ideal.
Right. But how do we get there? These are some pretty deeply ingrained patterns in society.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a process. But our source believes that even small changes can make a big difference. They talk about the importance of feedback loops.
Okay, what are feedback loops?
Essentially, it's about creating those opportunities for open communication and challenging our own biases.
So if someone makes an assumption about, what someone can or can't do based on their gender, gently pushing back on that assumption.
Exactly. It's about being open to learning and to, questioning our own perspectives and engaging in respectful dialogue.
Not about attacking anyone or, making them feel bad, but about actually opening up a conversation.
Exactly. Creating space for understanding and growth.
So we've talked about this gender paradox, why it exists, the double bind that it creates, and some potential solutions. But I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about this idea of subpersonalities that our source talks about.
What is that about?
This is where things get really personal. Our source shares their own journey with gender identity.
Okay.
And they talk about how they don't feel they fully identify as either male or female.
So not necessarily non-binary, but not fitting neatly into the mailbox either. Right. And they grapple with the limitations of these labels, feeling that even non-binary, while helpful for some, doesn't fully capture the nuances of their experience. So instead, they use this concept of subpersonalities.
That's so interesting. What do they mean by that?
They describe it as like feeling like different parts of themselves identify as male
Yep.
and other parts identify as female.
Wow.
It's not static or easily categorized. It's fluid and it's dynamic and it's constantly evolving.
I mean, that really resonates with me. It kind of speaks to this whole idea of like moving beyond the binary, right? Allowing for these more nuanced and fluid understandings of gender.
Absolutely. And what I find so striking about their perspective is this emphasis on understanding and open communication.
Mm.
It's not about like enforcing specific pronouns or labels on others.
Right, right. Not about policing language.
Exactly. It's more about curiosity, a willingness to ask questions and listen without judgment.
So creating that safe space for dialogue.
Precisely. And I think that's a really powerful message for all of us, regardless of where we fall on the gender spectrum.
Yeah, I think we could all benefit from being a little more open, a little bit more curious, and definitely more willing to listen and learn from each other.
Absolutely. Their approach really underscores the importance of embracing those, open doors and feedback loops they talk about.
It's like being willing to share your own perspective, but also being open to hearing other people's perspectives, even if they might challenge your own.
Yeah, exactly. It's about like building those bridges of understanding, right? Recognizing that even when we don't fully grasp someone else's experience, we can still listen with empathy and respect.
I love that. So after kind of diving deep into the source's perspective on the gender paradox, what are some of the key takeaways that you think our listeners should really kind of sit with?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the gender paradox is a complex issue with no easy solutions. It's not about finding like the right answer. It's about engaging in an ongoing conversation.
Acknowledging all the nuances and the complexities.
Exactly.
And all the individual experiences that shape our understanding of gender.
Right. Understanding the roots of this gender paradox, recognizing that double bind it creates, and embracing flexibility. I think those are crucial steps forward.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Right. Precisely. It's about creating that space for exploration, expression, evolution.
And remembering that we're all kind of in this together, navigating these questions of identity and belonging in a world that's constantly changing.
So keep those doors open, keep those feedback loops flowing, and keep asking those tough questions.
Because the more we understand, the more we connect, and ultimately, the more we grow as individuals and as a society.
Well said. That's what makes these deep dives so worthwhile. Thanks for joining us today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.